Sometimes the person everyone ignores is the one who can change an entire room. The wedding hall glittered beneath towering crystal chandeliers, each one scattering warm golden light across polished marble floors and tables dressed in ivory linen and silver centerpieces. Soft music floated through the air, and guests in tailored suits and elegant gowns chatted over glasses of champagne, their voices blending into the comfortable hum of a perfect evening. It was the kind of wedding people in Manhattan would talk about for weeks. Olivia Bennet's wedding. At the center of the room stood a long aisle lined with white roses and candles, leading toward a stage draped in silk where the ceremony would begin in less than 20 minutes. Photographers moved quietly along the edges of the ballroom, while a string quartet tuned their instruments near the stage. Everything was flawless, planned down to the smallest detail. Then the tall doors at the back of the ballroom slowly opened. Conversations softened, not because anyone had been asked to be quiet, but because something about the moment pulled attention like gravity. A man stepped inside first. Ethan Carter. Even in a crowded city like New York, Ethan Carter was a name people recognized. At 38, he was the founder of Carter Innovations, a tech company that had exploded across the market just a few years earlier. Tall, composed, wearing a midnight blue suit that fit him like it had been measured to the inch, Ethan carried the quiet confidence of someone used to boardrooms, headlines, and billion-dollar decisions. But tonight that wasn't what made people stare. What made the entire room slowly fall silent was the woman walking beside him. She wasn't anyone the guests recognized. Not from the social pages, not from charity galas, not from any of the circles that usually surrounded someone like Ethan Carter. Her name was Maya Johnson. Just 12 hours earlier, Maya had been sitting alone on a cold subway bench 20 blocks downtown, her coat pulled tight against the late winter wind that swept through the underground platform. The city above had been rushing forward as it always did. Yellow taxis splashing through puddles, office workers checking their watches, delivery bikes weaving through traffic. But underground, time had moved slower. Maya had watched the trains come and go, each one carrying strangers somewhere warm. In her lap rested a worn backpack that held everything she owned. But that morning, something unusual had happened. A Blacktown car had stopped near the subway entrance, and a man had stepped out, distracted, restless, like someone who had too many thoughts running at once. Ethan Carter had never planned to enter the subway that day. In fact, people like him usually didn't. But something about the quiet stillness of the platform had caught his attention. That was when he noticed Maya. She had been sitting straight despite the exhaustion in her eyes, her posture calm, almost dignified in a way that didn't match the circumstances around her. Most people passing by had barely looked at her. Ethan had, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he had stopped. What happened next had been impulsive, reckless even. "I need someone to pretend to be my girlfriend tonight," he had said, the words sounding strange even to his own ears. Maya had stared at him for a long second, trying to decide if he was joking. He hadn't been. "Just for a few hours," Ethan continued, his voice calm but unusually honest. "There's a wedding. I need to show up with someone." Maya had almost laughed. Not because the idea was funny, but because the entire situation felt unreal. A millionaire standing in the subway asking a homeless woman to attend a wedding with him. It sounded like the opening line of a story no one would believe. Yet here they were, standing in the most expensive ballroom in Midtown Manhattan. And as Ethan Carter and Maya Johnson walked slowly across the marble floor, every pair of eyes in the room followed them. Whispers began to ripple quietly through the crowd. Some people looked confused, others curious. A few simply stared. Near the front of the room, Olivia Bennet stood beside her fiancé Daniel Brooks, greeting guests before the ceremony began. She turned toward the entrance, just as Ethan and Maya stepped further into the ballroom. For a moment, Olivia's smile froze. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone to accuse her of losing composure, but enough for those closest to her to notice something had changed. Her eyes moved from Ethan to Maya and back again. The woman beside Ethan didn't look uncomfortable under the attention. If anything, she looked calm, graceful even. The simple black dress she wore moved softly as she walked, elegant in a way that made it hard to believe she had been sitting on a subway bench that morning. But the real surprise was the way she carried herself. Her shoulders relaxed, her gaze steady, like someone who understood exactly how to stand in a room full of judgment and not let it define her. Ethan noticed the silence spreading across the ballroom. He had expected curiosity, maybe even gossip, but he hadn't expected the strange feeling growing in his chest. Because somewhere between the subway station and this moment beneath the chandeliers, he had begun to realize something unsettling. He had brought Maya here to make a statement, to prove something to the woman who once left him behind. But as the room continued watching them, Ethan had the sudden, uncomfortable thought that tonight might not go the way he had planned at all. And when Olivia Bennet finally stepped forward with a polite smile and asked Maya a question meant to embarrass her in front of everyone, no one in that ballroom was prepared for what Maya Johnson would say next. Olivia Bennet held her smile the way someone trained by years of society events always did, perfectly balanced between politeness and quiet superiority. But the moment her eyes landed on Maya Johnson standing beside Ethan Carter, the air between them changed in a way the entire ballroom could feel without understanding why. Olivia took a slow step forward, the satin of her ivory gown catching the warm chandelier light as cameras shifted subtly toward the entrance, sensing a moment worth capturing. Guests pretended to return to their conversations, but no one truly did. Because in rooms like this people had an instinct for drama, and Ethan Carter arriving at the wedding of the woman who once left him behind had already been enough to spark curiosity. The unknown woman beside him turned that curiosity into a quiet storm. Olivia stopped just a few feet away from them and tilted her head slightly, studying Maya the way someone might study an unexpected detail in a carefully planned painting. Her smile widened just enough to appear gracious to the crowd around them. Daniel Brooks, the groom, stood behind her with the polite neutrality of a man who preferred business negotiations to emotional history. Ethan could feel the attention pressing in from every direction like a slow tightening circle. He had imagined this moment differently earlier that morning when the idea first entered his mind, back when he was standing outside the subway entrance staring down at the platform below and thinking about the wedding invitation that had arrived 3 weeks earlier in a thick ivory envelope. Olivia Bennet and Daniel Brooks request the honor of your presence. The words had felt less like an invitation and more like a quiet announcement that the chapter he once believed would be his future had already been rewritten. Ethan had spent days deciding whether to attend. Pride said no. Curiosity said yes. Something deeper had said he needed to show up not as the man people whispered about in business magazines, but as someone who had already moved on. That was the idea, at least. But when he walked into the subway station that morning, he had not been thinking about revenge or pride anymore. He had simply been restless. The city had that effect on people sometimes. And that was when he saw Maya Johnson sitting on the bench beneath the flickering fluorescent light. She had been reading something from a folded piece of paper with the focus of someone blocking out the noise of the world around her. Ethan had noticed something unusual immediately. It was not her clothes or the worn backpack beside her. It was the calm. Most people sitting in a subway station without a clear destination carried a certain tension, a guarded posture shaped by survival. Maya did not. She sat with her shoulders relaxed and her expression thoughtful, as if she were somewhere entirely different in her mind. When Ethan approached her, he had expected suspicion or confusion. What he received instead was a level, steady gaze that made him pause halfway through the sentence he had intended to say. I need someone to pretend to be my girlfriend tonight. Maya had blinked slowly at that, and then leaned back slightly on the bench. Pretend. She repeated the word as if testing its weight. Ethan had nodded once, aware that the entire proposal sounded absurd even to him. It is a wedding. Someone I used to know. I just need to show up with someone who does not belong to their world. Maya had watched him quietly for several seconds, long enough for Ethan to wonder if he had just made the strangest mistake of his life. Then she asked a single question. Why me? Ethan had not expected that question to be the hardest one. Because you look like someone who would not be impressed by any of this, he said finally. Back in the ballroom, the tension from that decision now hovered between them like invisible electricity. Olivia folded her hands lightly in front of her bouquet and finally spoke, her voice warm enough for the nearby guests to hear. Ethan, it is nice of you to come. I was not sure you would. Her eyes shifted toward Maya again. And you brought someone with you. How thoughtful. The sentence sounded kind, but the pause before the last word made the meaning clearer. Several guests nearby leaned slightly closer without appearing obvious about it. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Maya spoke first, her voice calm and even. Thank you for inviting him. Weddings are important days. Olivia's smile flickered just a fraction at the unexpected composure in Maya's tone. She tilted her head again, curiosity sharpening into something more deliberate. I do not believe we have met, Olivia said. Her gaze moved over Maya's simple black dress and the understated elegance of the way she stood. What was your name again? Maya Johnson. Maya answered easily. Olivia nodded once, as if filing the name into a place where it clearly did not belong in her social memory. And how did you and Ethan meet? The question landed softly, but the intention beneath it was unmistakable. A few guests exchanged quick glances. It was the kind of question that could easily turn into a quiet embarrassment depending on the answer. Ethan felt the moment tighten again. Earlier that day the plan had seemed simple. Arrive with someone unexpected. Smile politely. Leave before anything complicated happened. But standing there now, he realized something important. Maya Johnson did not look like someone who had agreed to play a part in his plan. She looked like someone entirely comfortable being herself. Maya glanced briefly at Ethan before returning her attention to Olivia. Then she smiled gently and said something so honest and unexpected that several people nearby stopped pretending not to listen. For a moment Maya Johnson simply held Olivia Bennett's gaze, calm in a way that felt almost disarming in a room where confidence was usually measured by wealth, connections, and carefully rehearsed introductions. Then Maya smiled slightly and answered the question in a voice clear enough for the nearby guests to hear. We met in the subway this morning. The words floated gently into the quiet air of the ballroom and immediately changed the temperature of the moment. Olivia blinked once, not because she had misunderstood, but because she had not expected an answer so simple. A few guests nearby shifted their weight almost instinctively, curiosity sharpening into fascination. Ethan Carter felt a small wave of disbelief pass through him as well. That had not been part of any plan. Maya could have said anything more polished. She could have invented a story about mutual friends or a charity event. Instead, she had chosen honesty. Olivia's smile returned, but this time it carried a faint edge of amusement. The subway, she repeated slowly, as if tasting the phrase. That is unexpected. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Ethan, then back to Maya. And what exactly were you doing in the subway this morning? The question sounded casual, but the intention beneath it was clear enough that several guests exchanged quiet looks. It was the kind of social test that often appeared at events like this, a polite-sounding sentence designed to reveal more than it seemed. Ethan felt the familiar tension of public attention begin to press against him again. Part of him wondered if Maya might finally feel uncomfortable under the scrutiny. Instead, she answered without hesitation. I was reading, Maya said simply. The response seemed to confuse Olivia more than it impressed her. Reading? Yes. Maya nodded lightly. I found a quiet place on the bench and decided to finish something I had started earlier. Ethan happened to walk by. The calm clarity of the explanation made the surrounding guests lean slightly closer, not physically but emotionally, the way people did when something unusual began unfolding in front of them. Olivia tilted her head once more, studying Maya with growing curiosity. And what were you reading? Maya's expression softened slightly at the question, as if the answer carried a small memory behind it. A book about urban architecture. Maya said, I used to enjoy learning how cities evolve over time. Sometimes the subway stations show more history than the streets above them. The sentence hung gently in the air. A few guests nearby blinked in mild surprise. That was not the answer anyone had expected from a woman Olivia had clearly been trying to categorize in a very specific way. Ethan watched the exchange carefully, realizing something important in that moment. Maya was not reacting defensively. She was simply existing inside the conversation exactly as she was. Olivia adjusted the bouquet in her hands slightly, still smiling, but now evaluating Maya with a more thoughtful expression. That is a very specific interest, she said. Were you studying architecture? For a moment Maya did not answer. Her gaze drifted briefly toward the tall windows along the far wall of the ballroom, where the city skyline glowed against the early evening sky. Then she returned her attention to Olivia. Something like that, she said quietly. The phrase carried enough ambiguity to open more questions, but enough finality to close the topic at the same time. Several people in the surrounding circle sensed it immediately. The woman standing beside Ethan Carter was not someone easily pushed into an embarrassing explanation. Olivia seemed to recognize it as well. She gave a small, polite laugh that drifted through the nearby cluster of guests. Well, New York certainly brings together the most interesting people. Her tone suggested the moment had reached its natural conclusion, but the curiosity in the room had only deepened. Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm but measured. Maya agreed to help me attend tonight. I did not want to come alone. That part at least was true. Olivia's eyes rested on him for a brief moment, something unreadable passing through them before she nodded slowly. I see, she said. Then she turned slightly toward Daniel Brooks, who had been watching the conversation with quiet interest. Daniel offered Ethan a courteous handshake. It is good to see you here tonight, Ethan, Daniel said politely. I hope you enjoy the evening. Ethan returned the handshake with equal composure. Congratulations, he said. As Daniel and Olivia moved to greet another arriving guest, the tension around Ethan and Maya loosened slightly, though the attention in the room had not disappeared. People resumed conversations, but the glances continued. Ethan exhaled slowly and looked down at Maya. That was not the answer I expected, he admitted quietly. Maya glanced at him with a faint smile. It was the truth. Ethan considered that for a moment. The truth had not been part of his strategy earlier that day. Yet somehow the honesty in her words had shifted the entire mood of the room. Instead of whispers filled with pity or mockery, the guests now looked at Maya with a kind of cautious curiosity. Who is she? The unspoken question floated everywhere. Maya noticed the same thing and gently folded her hands together in front of her. You look surprised, she said softly. Ethan shook his head slightly. Not surprised. Just realizing that tonight might not go the way I thought it would. Maya's smile deepened just a little at that. Sometimes the best evenings do not follow the plan people started with, she said calmly. And as the string quartet began playing the first notes that signaled the ceremony would soon begin, Ethan Carter had the quiet realization that bringing Maya Johnson to this wedding might turn out to be the most unpredictable decision he had made in years. The first notes of the string quartet spread gently across the ballroom like a signal that the evening was moving forward whether the guests were ready or not. Conversations softened again as people began finding their seats along the aisle lined with white roses and candlelight. The glow from the chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors and crystal glasses, giving the entire room a quiet golden warmth that made everything appear calm on the surface. Yet beneath that polished calm, the curiosity surrounding Ethan Carter and the woman beside him continued to ripple through the crowd. Maya Johnson noticed it immediately. Years of observing people had taught her that attention had different textures. Sometimes it felt sharp and judgmental. Sometimes it felt merely curious. Tonight it was both. Several guests passed nearby on their way to their seats and gave Ethan polite nods before letting their eyes linger on Maya a second longer than social manners usually allowed. Ethan adjusted his cuff slightly and leaned closer to Maya as they stepped aside near one of the tall windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The city outside glowed in the early evening like a field of quiet stars. You handled that conversation better than most executives I know, Ethan said quietly. Maya glanced toward the aisle where guests were settling into their chairs. I did not realize it was a competition. Ethan allowed a small smile to appear before he looked back toward the front of the room, where Olivia Bennett was now speaking with the wedding coordinator. I assumed Olivia would try something like that. Maya studied his expression for a moment. Not with anger, more with a calm curiosity. She seems like someone who likes to understand where people fit. Ethan nodded slowly. Olivia likes things to be predictable. She built her life around that idea. Maya turned slightly, so she could see the entire room from where they stood. The long tables decorated with silver centerpieces. The quiet elegance of the guests. The subtle choreography of waitstaff moving carefully with trays of champagne. It is a beautiful wedding, she said. Ethan followed her gaze across the ballroom. Olivia always liked beautiful things. Maya noticed something in his voice then. Not bitterness exactly. Something closer to distance. The kind that comes after people realize a chapter of their life has already closed. Did you love her? Maya asked gently. Ethan paused for a moment before answering. I thought I did, he said honestly. The difference between thinking and knowing sometimes takes time to understand. Maya nodded slightly as if that answer made sense to her. The string quartet shifted into a softer melody while guests continued settling into their seats. A man in a dark gray suit approached Ethan with the relaxed confidence of someone familiar with the world of business events. Ethan, I was wondering if you would show up tonight. The man extended his hand with a friendly smile. Ethan shook his hand politely. Michael Grant. Good to see you. Michael glanced toward Maya with open curiosity, but without the subtle judgment others had shown. And who is this? Ethan turned slightly toward Maya. This is Maya Johnson. Maya offered a calm nod. Nice to meet you. Michael returned the gesture easily. Nice to meet you as well. He paused before adding with a faint grin. You certainly made an entrance tonight. A few nearby guests chuckled softly at the comment. Ethan gave a small shrug. I never liked arriving quietly. Michael laughed once before glancing toward the front of the room. Well, the ceremony is about to begin. I should find my seat before Olivia starts assigning them personally. Ethan and Maya watched him walk toward the aisle before the quiet attention of the surrounding guests returned once again. Maya exhaled slowly. This room feels like a theater. Ethan raised an eyebrow. A theater? Yes. Maya said thoughtfully. Everyone is watching everyone else. But pretending they are not. Ethan looked around the ballroom again and realized she was not wrong. Social events like this often worked exactly that way. People measured each other with quiet glances and invisible expectations. The music softened further, and the officiant stepped toward the front of the aisle. Guests straightened in their chairs. The ceremony will begin shortly. A wedding coordinator announced gently. Ethan turned toward Maya. We can leave if you want. He said quietly. Maya looked surprised by the offer. I thought you wanted to be here. Ethan considered that question carefully. Earlier that morning his reasons had felt clear. Pride. Closure. Maybe even a quiet form of revenge. But now those reasons felt strangely distant. I did, he admitted. But I did not expect tonight to feel this different. Maya studied him for a moment, and then gave a small reassuring smile. Sometimes closure does not come from watching someone else move on. Sometimes it comes from realizing you already have. Ethan did not answer right away. Instead, he followed Maya toward the row of chairs near the back, where 2 empty seats waited. As they sat down, the music rose gently, and the doors at the front of the ballroom opened for the wedding procession. Guests turned their attention toward the aisle as the ceremony began. For several minutes the room focused on the simple beauty of the moment. The exchange of vows. The quiet smiles. The promise of a future beginning for 2 people standing beneath a canopy of white roses and candlelight. Yet even as Ethan watched the ceremony unfold, he found himself glancing occasionally toward Maya sitting beside him. She watched the vows with a calm expression that carried both warmth and distance at the same time. Almost as if she had seen many versions of life unfold before and understood something about them others did not. When the officiant finally pronounced Olivia and Daniel married, the room filled with applause. Guests stood and began congratulating the newly married couple as the reception portion of the evening began. Music grew livelier. Waiters moved quickly with trays of sparkling drinks. And slowly the conversations in the ballroom returned. Ethan stood beside Maya as the crowd formed small circles of celebration. Then from across the room Olivia Bennett turned toward them once again. This time her smile was brighter, and her eyes carried a spark of curiosity that suggested the evening was far from over. The applause gradually softened as the newly married couple walked down the aisle together, smiling beneath the warm chandelier light, while guests raised their glasses in celebration. The quiet elegance of the ceremony dissolved into the livelier rhythm of the reception as waiters began circulating with trays of champagne, and the string quartet shifted into a more upbeat melody. Conversations returned across the ballroom like gentle waves, and the atmosphere grew brighter, lighter, almost festive. Yet in the middle of that celebration, a subtle current of curiosity still surrounded Ethan Carter and Maya Johnson. People tried not to stare directly, but their eyes returned again and again. Who is she? The silent question lingered in nearly every glance. Ethan noticed it, of course. He had spent years attending events like this and knew exactly how quickly a new story could become the center of attention. But strangely, he did not feel the usual irritation that attention often brought. Instead, he found himself watching Maya. She stood beside him with the quiet composure of someone who understood she was being observed and yet refused to be shaped by it. A waiter passed with a tray of champagne flutes, and Maya accepted one with a polite thank you before handing another to Ethan. To surviving the evening, she said lightly as she raised her glass. Ethan gave a small, amused breath. I thought the difficult part was already over. Maya glanced around the ballroom where clusters of guests were beginning to gather in conversation. I have a feeling the evening is only getting started. Ethan followed her gaze and saw what she meant. Olivia Bennet was moving through the crowd with Daniel Brooks at her side, greeting guests and accepting congratulations. But every few moments Olivia's eyes drifted back toward Ethan and Maya, as if she were trying to solve a quiet puzzle. Maya noticed it as well. She is curious, Maya said softly. Olivia always was. Ethan replied. The difference is that tonight she cannot control the answer. Maya smiled slightly at that, but did not respond. Instead, she watched as a group of guests approached them with polite enthusiasm. The first was a tall woman in a navy blue dress who introduced herself with practiced ease. Catherine Moore, she said with a warm smile. I believe we have met before, Ethan, at the Hartford Charity Gala. Ethan nodded politely. Of course. Good to see you again, Catherine. Catherine's eyes moved to Maya with friendly curiosity rather than judgment. And you must be the mysterious guest everyone is talking about tonight. Maya returned the smile calmly. Maya Johnson. Nice to meet you. Catherine tilted her head slightly, clearly intrigued by the simplicity of the introduction. Well, Maya Johnson, you certainly made an unforgettable entrance. Maya took a small sip of champagne before answering. Sometimes entrances are only memorable because people were already expecting something ordinary. Catherine laughed softly at that. I like that answer, she said before glancing at Ethan. You always did bring interesting people into a room. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. I'm not sure if that was meant as a compliment. Catherine smiled knowingly before excusing herself to greet another group of guests. As she walked away, Maya leaned closer to Ethan. That woman is observant. Ethan nodded. She runs a consulting firm. Observing people is part of her business. Maya watched Catherine join another circle of conversation across the room. It must be exhausting for everyone here to measure each other all the time. Ethan followed her gaze again. It is the way their world works. Reputation, influence, connections. Maya turned toward him again with a thoughtful expression. And your world? Ethan considered the question for a moment. For a long time I thought it was mine too, he said quietly. A burst of laughter from across the ballroom drew their attention as Daniel Brooks began telling a story to several guests near the center of the room. The energy of the reception was growing now as the band prepared to take over from the quartet, and the dance floor lights flickered softly to life. Then a familiar voice appeared beside them. I was hoping you would stay for the reception. Ethan turned and saw Olivia Bennet approaching again, this time alone. Her expression was bright and perfectly composed. The expression of someone comfortable at the center of attention. I would not miss the rest of the evening, Ethan replied calmly. Olivia glanced briefly at Maya and then back at Ethan. I am glad. There are still several traditions left tonight. Her eyes returned to Maya with renewed curiosity, including a toast. Maya tilted her head slightly. A toast? Yes, Olivia said with a soft smile. Daniel, and I thought it would be interesting if a few unexpected guests shared a few words about love and timing. The suggestion hung in the air like a carefully placed invitation that was not entirely innocent. Ethan felt the subtle shift in the moment immediately. Olivia was not finished testing the mystery she had discovered tonight. Maya seemed to sense it as well, but her expression remained calm. What an interesting idea, Maya said gently. Olivia's smile widened slightly. I thought you might enjoy it, she said. The band began playing the opening notes of a slow jazz melody as guests gathered closer to the dance floor. Olivia glanced toward the stage where a microphone stood ready beside the band. I will announce the toasts in a few minutes, she said before turning gracefully back toward the crowd. Ethan watched her walk away and then looked at Maya with mild concern. You do not have to do that, he said quietly. Maya finished her sip of champagne and set the empty glass carefully on a nearby table. Sometimes the most interesting stories begin when people think they are setting a trap, she said calmly. Ethan studied her expression for a moment and realized something that made him both curious and slightly nervous. Maya Johnson did not look like someone walking into a trap at all. She looked like someone who had already decided how the story would end. The soft jazz melody from the band slowly filled the ballroom as guests drifted toward the dance floor, and small circles of conversation formed beneath the golden chandelier light. Laughter rose from one table, while champagne glasses clinked at another, and for a moment the reception carried the comfortable rhythm of celebration. Yet beneath that rhythm a quiet anticipation had begun to grow. the subtle awareness that something unusual was about to happen. Maya Johnson noticed it in the way several guests began glancing toward the small stage near the band where a microphone stood waiting. She also noticed the way Olivia Bennet occasionally looked toward that same microphone with the calm confidence of someone who believed the evening was unfolding exactly as she intended. Ethan Carter stood beside Maya near the edge of the dance floor, watching the movement of the room with thoughtful eyes. "I have a feeling Olivia did not choose that toast idea by accident," Ethan said quietly. Maya looked toward the stage as a wedding coordinator adjusted the microphone stand. People rarely introduce surprises unless they expect to control the outcome. Ethan studied her expression carefully. "You still do not have to participate." Maya turned slightly toward him, the soft light from the chandeliers reflecting in her eyes. "Earlier today you asked me to pretend to be part of your world for a few hours," she said calmly. "I think I can manage one conversation." Ethan almost smiled at that, but the tension in his shoulders did not completely disappear. The band gradually lowered their volume, and the wedding coordinator stepped toward the stage with a small bell that chimed gently through the ballroom. Guests turned their attention toward the front as the music faded and the room settled into expectant silence. Olivia Bennet appeared beside the microphone with effortless grace, the soft satin of her gown catching the warm light as she looked out over the gathering of friends, colleagues, and family. "Thank you all for celebrating with us tonight," Olivia said warmly. "Daniel and I are grateful for every person who joined us for this special evening." Her voice carried easily across the room, practiced and confident in the way of someone who had spoken at many elegant events before. "Tonight is about new beginnings," Olivia continued. "But sometimes the most interesting stories come from unexpected moments." A gentle ripple of polite laughter moved through the crowd as she glanced briefly toward Ethan and Maya. "So Daniel and I thought it might be fun to invite a few guests to share a short thought about love, timing, and the surprising paths life can take." The idea seemed harmless enough on the surface. Guests nodded with mild curiosity while waiters paused at the edges of the room. Olivia's gaze moved again through the crowd before settling exactly where everyone expected it would. "Ethan Carter," she said with a bright smile. "You have always had an interesting perspective on life. Would you mind sharing a few words?" The room turned toward Ethan immediately. Some guests looked excited by the unexpected moment, while others simply watched with quiet fascination. Ethan felt the familiar pressure of public attention settle around him like a spotlight. Speaking to a crowd was not something that frightened him. He had done it countless times at conferences and business events. But tonight felt different. Because tonight was not about quarterly reports or company growth. It was about something personal. Ethan glanced briefly at Maya. Her expression remained calm, almost encouraging. "Go ahead," she said softly. Ethan exhaled once and stepped toward the stage. The marble floor reflected the soft light as he walked forward and accepted the microphone from Olivia. She stepped aside with a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Ethan turned toward the room, filled with familiar faces and curious strangers. For a moment, he simply looked at them. "People often talk about timing." Ethan began slowly. "In business, we believe timing can build or destroy an entire company. In life, it can do something even more interesting." The room listened quietly. "Sometimes timing shows you that the future you thought you wanted was not actually the one meant for you." Ethan continued. Several guests nodded thoughtfully, while others glanced toward Olivia with careful discretion. Ethan's gaze moved briefly toward Maya, standing near the back of the room. "And sometimes the most unexpected meeting can change the direction of an entire evening." A quiet murmur of interest moved through the crowd. Ethan returned the microphone to the stand and stepped away with a polite nod. The guests applauded warmly. Olivia clapped as well, though the thoughtful look in her eyes suggested she had been hoping for something slightly different. "Thank you, Ethan," she said smoothly as she stepped back to the microphone. "That was very insightful. Now I believe there is another guest we would all love to hear from." The room grew even quieter this time because nearly everyone already knew who she meant. Olivia's smile returned with elegant precision as she turned toward the back of the ballroom. "Maya Johnson," she said gently, "since you and Ethan had such an interesting beginning today, perhaps you could share your thoughts as well." Every pair of eyes in the room shifted toward Maya. Ethan felt his pulse tighten slightly as she began walking toward the stage. Yet Maya moved with the same calm confidence she had carried all evening, her posture relaxed, her gaze steady. The quiet sound of her steps across the marble floor echoed softly through the ballroom. When she reached the stage, she accepted the microphone with a polite nod and turned toward the room, filled with curious faces. For a moment she simply looked at them, the way someone might observe a city skyline before deciding where to begin a story. Then Maya Johnson smiled gently and began to speak. Maya Johnson stood beneath the soft glow of the stage lights with the microphone resting lightly in her hands while the entire ballroom waited. The quiet in the room felt different now, deeper and more focused than before, as if every guest sensed that something unusual was about to unfold. Maya looked across the crowd slowly, taking in the elegant dresses, the tailored suits, the polished confidence that filled the room. She saw the curiosity in their eyes, the silent question that had followed her since the moment she walked through the ballroom doors. Then she smiled gently. Earlier today, I was sitting on a subway bench about 3 miles from here. Maya began calmly. A small ripple of surprise moved through the crowd, not loud enough to break the silence, but strong enough to shift the atmosphere. I had a cup of coffee that cost $2.50, a worn backpack beside me, and a book about how cities grow and change over time. Maya continued. Some people glanced toward Ethan Carter, others toward Olivia Bennet, while a few leaned slightly forward in their chairs. Maya's voice remained steady, thoughtful, almost reflective. When you spend time in a city like New York, you notice something interesting. The streets above ground are full of movement and energy, but the subway stations below show you the layers of history that built the city. Every wall, every tunnel tells a story about the people who passed through there before us. Maya paused for a moment, letting the quiet settle deeper in the room. And sometimes you meet someone in those places who changes the direction of your day in ways you never expected. Her eyes drifted briefly toward Ethan, standing near the back of the ballroom. This morning a stranger sat down beside me and asked a very unusual question. He said he needed someone to pretend to be his girlfriend for the evening. A soft murmur moved through the guests, followed by a few surprised smiles. Maya allowed a small laugh to escape before continuing. At first I thought he must be joking, because in most stories people like him and people like me do not share the same chapter. But life has a strange sense of timing. Maya slowly walked a few steps across the stage as she spoke, her voice carrying naturally through the quiet ballroom. Sometimes the most unexpected invitations show you something important about the world around you. I accepted because I was curious. Curious about why someone with every advantage would ask a stranger from a subway bench to walk into a room like this beside him. She looked across the guests again, her expression warm but thoughtful. Tonight I have seen something interesting. This room is filled with successful people. People who have built companies, led organizations, created beautiful lives for themselves and the people they love. That deserves respect. Several guests nodded quietly, appreciating the sincerity in her tone. But success can sometimes create invisible walls between us. Walls built from assumptions about where someone belongs and what their story must be. The room had grown completely silent now. Even the band members behind the stage had paused their quiet preparation to listen. Maya folded her hands lightly around the microphone and continued. Earlier tonight someone asked me what I was doing in the subway this morning. I said I was reading. That answer surprised a few people. Maya's smile returned slightly. But curiosity and learning do not belong to one neighborhood or another. They belong to anyone who chooses them. A few guests exchanged thoughtful glances while others watched Maya with growing respect. Maya lifted her gaze toward Olivia and Daniel, standing near the front of the room. Weddings celebrate the beginning of a new chapter. She said gently, and every chapter in life is shaped by the choices we make about how we see other people. Whether we see them as strangers who do not belong in our world or as individuals with stories we have not taken the time to understand. Maya paused again, letting her final thoughts settle into the quiet air. Tonight, I walked into this room because someone was willing to step outside the expectations people had written for him. She said, and I think that is something worth celebrating. The silence that followed lasted for several seconds. Not the uncomfortable silence of confusion, but the thoughtful silence of people realizing they had just heard something honest. Then a single pair of hands began to clap near the back of the ballroom. Ethan Carter. The applause spread slowly. At first, then stronger, until the entire room filled with the sound. Maya nodded politely, and returned the microphone to its stand before stepping down from the stage. As she walked back toward Ethan, the expressions around the room had changed. The curiosity was still there, but it was no longer mixed with quiet judgment. It had transformed into something closer to admiration. Ethan watched her approach with a look he had not worn all evening, a look of genuine respect. That was not what anyone expected, he said quietly when she reached him. Maya gave a soft shrug. Sometimes expectations are just stories people tell themselves. Ethan glanced across the ballroom, where several guests were now whispering with new interest. I think you just changed the entire mood of this wedding. Maya looked around the room where conversations had resumed with a very different tone than before. She smiled gently. Sometimes all it takes is a different perspective. But across the ballroom, Olivia Bennet watched the scene with thoughtful eyes, her expression calm, yet calculating, as if she had just realized that the woman she invited to speak might be far more complicated than she had imagined. The applause slowly faded, but the energy in the ballroom had clearly shifted. What had started as quiet curiosity toward Maya Johnson had transformed into something far more powerful. Conversations resumed across the room, but this time they carried a different tone. People were not whispering about the mysterious woman beside Ethan Carter anymore. They were discussing what she had said. The band resumed playing a gentle jazz rhythm, while waiters continued circulating with champagne. Yet more than a few guests kept glancing toward Maya with a mixture of intrigue and respect. Ethan noticed it immediately. When Maya reached him near the edge of the dance floor, he gave a quiet breath of disbelief. You just turned an awkward social test into the most memorable speech of the evening. Maya gave a soft smile as she looked around the room. I only said what I believed. Ethan studied her expression for a moment, still trying to understand the calm confidence she carried so naturally. Most people in that situation would have tried to impress the room. Maya shook her head lightly. Impressing people rarely changes anything, but reminding them of something they already know can. Across the ballroom, a small group of guests had gathered near Catherine Moore, the woman who earlier had spoken with Ethan. Catherine was clearly retelling Maya's speech with animated interest, while several others listened closely. Even the wedding band members appeared more relaxed now as the mood of the reception turned warmer and more open. Ethan glanced toward the stage where Olivia Bennet and Daniel Brooks were speaking quietly with a few family members. Olivia's posture remained elegant and composed, but her attention returned again and again toward Maya. She was smiling politely for photographs, but her eyes carried the thoughtful focus of someone reevaluating a situation she thought she understood. Maya followed Ethan's gaze. She is reconsidering something, Maya said calmly. Ethan nodded. Olivia has always liked to understand every variable in the room. Maya lifted an eyebrow slightly. Tonight might be the first time she cannot. Before Ethan could respond, a man approached them with an enthusiastic expression. He looked to be in his early 50s, wearing a charcoal suit and glasses that gave him the air of a professor rather than a businessman. That was remarkable, the man said warmly. Maya turned toward him with polite curiosity. Thank you. The man extended his hand. Thomas Caldwell. I run a design firm that focuses on urban development projects in Chicago. Maya shook his hand. Nice to meet you. Thomas glanced at Ethan briefly before returning his attention to Maya. Your comment about cities and subway stations revealing history was fascinating. Most people only see infrastructure. You spoke about it like someone who has studied it deeply. Maya hesitated for a moment before answering. I have always been interested in how environments shape human behavior. Thomas smiled with obvious approval. That is exactly the kind of thinking that inspires meaningful design. He paused and looked at her more closely. Forgive me if this sounds unusual, but have you ever worked in architecture or planning? Ethan watched Maya carefully as she considered the question. The room around them continued buzzing with celebration, but this conversation had quietly drawn the attention of several nearby guests. I studied architecture for a while, Maya said gently. Thomas raised his eyebrows in surprise. Studied? That suggests you did more than simply read about it. Maya gave a small thoughtful smile, but did not elaborate further. Ethan noticed the subtle way she redirected the conversation without dismissing it entirely. Thomas seemed to recognize it as well and gave a respectful nod. Well, if you ever return to that field, I hope our paths cross again. The industry could use more voices like yours. After he moved away, Ethan turned toward Maya with clear curiosity. You studied architecture. Maya took a sip of water from a nearby table before answering. A long time ago. Ethan leaned slightly closer. You did not mention that earlier. Maya glanced toward the tall windows where the Manhattan skyline glowed against the darkening evening sky. Some chapters of life take time to explain. Ethan sensed the quiet weight behind those words and decided not to press further. Instead, he looked around the ballroom again. The reception had now reached its liveliest moment. Music had grown louder. Couples were beginning to step onto the dance floor, while laughter echoed across the room. Yet even within that joyful atmosphere, something subtle had changed. Maya was no longer the mysterious outsider people whispered about. She had become the unexpected voice everyone wanted to understand. Across the ballroom, Olivia Bennett finally began walking toward them again. This time she was not alone. Daniel Brooks walked beside her, and both wore polite smiles that suggested they had something specific in mind. Ethan noticed their approach immediately. Round 2. He murmured quietly. Maya followed his gaze and watched the newly married couple moving confidently through the crowd toward them. She did not appear nervous. In fact, her expression carried the same calm curiosity she had shown all evening. Sometimes the story becomes more interesting after the first surprise, she said softly. Olivia and Daniel stopped a few steps in front of them. Olivia's smile was warm, but her eyes carried a sharp intelligence. Maya Johnson. That was quite a speech, she said gracefully. Maya inclined her head slightly. Thank you. Olivia folded her hands lightly and studied her for a moment. I must admit something. When Ethan arrived tonight, I assumed he was trying to prove a point. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Ethan before returning to Maya. Now I am beginning to wonder if there is more to your story than any of us expected. The guest standing nearby fell quietly attentive again as Olivia asked the question she had clearly been preparing. Tell me, Maya, she said with a thoughtful smile. Who were you before we met you on that subway bench? For a moment, the music, the laughter, and even the movement of the waiters seemed to fade into the background as Olivia Bennett's question settled quietly in the air between them. The nearby guests stopped their conversations again, not dramatically, but with the subtle awareness that something important might follow. Maya Johnson did not answer immediately. She looked at Olivia with the same calm expression she had carried all evening, the kind of expression that came from someone who had learned not to rush the truth. Ethan Carter watched her closely, suddenly aware that he knew almost nothing about the woman standing beside him except the brief story that began on a subway bench that morning. Daniel Brooks stood quietly next to Olivia, his posture relaxed but attentive, as if he too had become curious about the unexpected guest who had managed to shift the entire mood of their wedding reception. Maya finally spoke, her voice steady and thoughtful. Before today, I was someone who had spent many years trying to design better spaces for people to live in. The words drew immediate interest from the guests standing closest. Several exchanged surprised glances while Thomas Caldwell, the architect who had spoken with her earlier, leaned forward slightly with clear recognition. Maya continued calmly. I studied architecture in Boston and later worked with a small urban planning firm that focused on community development projects. We believe cities should grow in ways that support the people who live in them, not just the businesses that profit from them. A few guests nodded thoughtfully. It was not the kind of background anyone had expected from the mysterious woman who had arrived with Ethan. Olivia's eyes narrowed slightly in curiosity, but her smile remained perfectly polite. That sounds like meaningful work, she said. Maya nodded. It was. For a long time I believed I would spend my entire career helping cities design better housing and public spaces. Ethan felt a quiet sense of surprise rising inside him. The woman he had met that morning had been sitting quietly with a worn backpack and a book, yet she spoke about architecture and urban development with the confidence of someone deeply familiar with the field. What happened? Daniel asked gently, his tone sincere rather than probing. Maya paused again before answering. Life happened, she said softly. The room remained silent as she continued. A few years ago, the firm I worked for was involved in a large redevelopment project. The goal was to transform an old industrial district into affordable housing and community parks. It was a project I cared deeply about, but the investors behind the project had different priorities. Maya's voice remained calm, but carried the quiet weight of experience. When disagreements began about how the land should be used, the project became more about profit than community. I spoke out against several decisions that would have displaced thousands of families who had lived there for decades. A murmur moved through the nearby guests as the story began to take shape. Maya looked down briefly before continuing. When powerful people disagree with you, the consequences can arrive quickly. The firm lost several major investors. The project collapsed. And the easiest way for everyone else to protect their reputation was to blame the person who had raised the objections. Ethan felt a tightening in his chest as he realized where the story was leading. You became the scapegoat, Ethan said quietly. Maya gave a small nod. That is one way to describe it. Within a few months the firm closed, and my professional reputation followed the same path. She looked around the ballroom again, meeting the eyes of several guests who were listening carefully now. When people search your name online and find controversy attached to it, opportunities begin to disappear, even when the truth is more complicated than the headlines. Olivia studied Maya thoughtfully, the polite curiosity in her expression slowly shifting into something more genuine. And you never returned to the industry? She asked. Maya gave a faint smile that carried both humor and resignation. I tried for a while, but eventually the doors stopped opening. The room remained silent again for several seconds. It was the kind of story that made people reconsider their first assumptions. Finally, Maya glanced toward Ethan with a calm expression. That is how I eventually found myself sitting on a subway bench this morning reading a book about cities instead of designing them. Ethan looked at her with quiet respect. You spoke the truth about something important and paid the price for it. Maya shrugged gently. Sometimes the price of honesty is simply time. Time for the world to catch up with the truth. Olivia remained thoughtful for a moment before nodding slowly. That is a difficult path, she admitted. Maya's expression softened slightly. Many people walk difficult paths. Some are simply less visible than others. The nearby guests seemed to absorb her words with new understanding. The mysterious woman they had quietly judged earlier now stood before them as someone whose story carried far more depth than anyone had imagined. Daniel finally smiled warmly. Well, Maya Johnson, I am glad our wedding reception gave you an unexpected stage tonight. Maya returned the smile politely. Life seems to enjoy unusual timing. The music slowly rose again as the band resumed playing, and the conversations across the ballroom gradually returned. Yet the energy had changed once more. This time the curiosity surrounding Maya was no longer about where she belonged in the room. It was about the quiet strength she carried within it. For several moments after Maya Johnson finished speaking, the conversations around the ballroom returned slowly, almost cautiously, as if the guests were still processing what they had just heard. The elegant reception hall no longer felt like a stage for polite appearances. It felt like a room where something genuine had slipped through the carefully arranged social atmosphere. People who had earlier glanced at Maya with quiet curiosity were now looking at her with a very different expression. Respect had replaced assumption. Ethan Carter noticed it immediately. He watched as a few guests who had barely acknowledged Maya earlier now nodded toward her as they passed, offering small smiles or thoughtful greetings. It was a subtle shift, but it was real. Maya, however, did not seem particularly interested in the attention. She stood beside Ethan near one of the tall windows overlooking the glowing Manhattan skyline. Her posture relaxed as she watched the city lights flicker in the distance. The band continued playing a soft jazz rhythm while the reception moved forward with renewed energy. Couples had begun dancing, and the laughter across the room carried a warmer tone than it had earlier in the evening. Ethan finally spoke quietly. You changed the entire story people were telling about you tonight. Maya gave a small, thoughtful smile, without looking away from the window. People usually tell stories about strangers because they are uncomfortable with unanswered questions. Ethan crossed his arms slightly as he considered that. And now they have answers. Maya turned toward him gently. Now they have a different question. Ethan raised an eyebrow. What question? Maya glanced toward the center of the ballroom where a group of guests were discussing her earlier comments about architecture. The question of what happens next. Before Ethan could respond, a familiar voice approached them from behind. I believe I might know the answer to that question. They both turned and saw Thomas Caldwell approaching again, this time with a slightly more serious expression. Thomas adjusted his glasses as he looked at Maya. I apologize if I am interrupting your evening, but I have been thinking about what you said earlier. Maya listened politely. Thomas continued. I did some quick searching while you were speaking with Olivia and Daniel. When you mentioned the redevelopment project that collapsed a few years ago, I realized I had heard about it before. Several people nearby slowed their conversations as they recognized the direction of the discussion. Thomas looked directly at Maya now. The Riverside Community Development Project. Maya nodded once. Yes. Thomas gave a thoughtful breath. That project became controversial because investors wanted to convert most of the land into high-end commercial properties. The original planning documents argued strongly against that change. Maya's eyes remained calm. Those documents were written by me. Thomas gave a quiet nod of recognition. I thought so, he said. And the more I remembered about that project, the more I realized something important. The professional report that opposed the commercial redesign eventually became a case study at several universities for ethical urban planning decisions. Ethan looked surprised. A case study. Thomas nodded again. Yes. It was widely respected among planning experts because it defended the long-term needs of the community rather than short-term profit. He paused before adding. The name of the lead planner on that report was Maya Johnson. A quiet ripple of surprise passed through the guests standing nearby. Maya did not appear surprised by the revelation. She simply gave a small nod. That was a long time ago. Thomas looked at her with open admiration. Perhaps. But the professional community did not forget it. Several planning schools still reference that report when teaching students about responsible development. Ethan looked at Maya with a new level of respect. You never mentioned that part. Maya shrugged gently. Achievements do not change what happened afterward. Thomas considered her words carefully. Perhaps not immediately, but time has a way of correcting certain misunderstandings. He glanced briefly around the room before returning his attention to Maya. My firm is currently leading a major redevelopment project in Chicago focused on affordable housing and public spaces. We have been searching for someone with exactly the perspective you described earlier tonight. Maya listened quietly, clearly understanding where the conversation was heading. Thomas continued with calm sincerity. I would like to invite you to speak with my team about joining the project as a senior planning consultant. The words seemed to pause the surrounding conversations again. Ethan felt a quiet sense of astonishment. Just 12 hours earlier, Maya had been sitting on a subway bench reading a book. Now one of the most respected design firms in the room was offering her an opportunity in front of dozens of witnesses. Maya remained thoughtful for a moment before answering. That is a generous offer. Thomas smiled slightly. It is not generosity. It is recognition. He said, cities need people who are willing to defend communities even when it is inconvenient. Ethan looked between them, realizing that the evening had taken yet another unexpected turn. Maya finally nodded gently. I would be willing to have that conversation. Thomas extended his hand warmly. I look forward to it. As he stepped away, Ethan let out a quiet breath of disbelief. 12 hours ago, I asked you to pretend to be part of my world for one evening. Maya looked at him calmly. And tonight your world introduced me to a new chapter. Ethan smiled slightly as he glanced around the ballroom, where the celebration continued under the warm chandelier light. I think you might have just changed more than your own story tonight. Maya followed his gaze toward the lively dance floor. Sometimes stories change simply because people are finally ready to listen. The music in the ballroom continued flowing smoothly as the reception moved deeper into the evening. But for Ethan Carter, the atmosphere no longer felt the same as it had only an hour earlier. What had begun as a carefully controlled appearance at a wedding he once thought would have been his own had quietly transformed into something far more meaningful. Across the dance floor, couples were laughing and spinning beneath the golden chandelier light, while waiters moved gracefully between tables with trays of champagne and small desserts. Yet Ethan found himself standing near the tall windows once again, watching the reflection of the city lights in the glass beside Maya Johnson. The skyline stretched across the dark horizon like a silent reminder of how many lives and stories existed within the same city. Maya seemed to be studying the view with quiet appreciation. Chicago will not look like this, Ethan said lightly, breaking the silence. Maya smiled faintly. Every city has its own rhythm. Ethan looked at her thoughtfully. You did not seem surprised by Thomas Caldwell's offer. Maya folded her hands lightly in front of her. Surprised perhaps, but not shocked. Ethan leaned slightly against the marble window ledge. You speak about architecture in cities as if you never truly left that world. Maya's gaze remained on the skyline. Because in a way I never did. She said calmly, when something becomes part of how you see the world, it does not disappear simply because your career changes direction. Ethan studied her expression again, noticing the quiet confidence that seemed natural to her. Earlier that day, he had assumed Maya Johnson was simply someone who had been unlucky enough to fall through the cracks of a complicated system. Now he realized she was someone who had made difficult choices based on principle. And those choices had shaped her life in ways that few people in this room could fully understand. Ethan finally spoke again. "I owe you an apology." Maya turned slightly toward him with mild curiosity. "For what?" "For the way I approached you this morning." Ethan admitted honestly. "I treated the whole situation like a simple arrangement." Maya's smile returned gently. "It was a simple arrangement." Ethan shook his head slowly. "Not anymore." Maya noticed the sincerity in his tone and studied him for a moment before responding. "You gave me a seat at a table I would never have entered on my own tonight. That has value." Ethan gave a quiet laugh. "I was not exactly thinking about opportunity when I asked you to come." Maya tilted her head slightly. "What were you thinking about?" Ethan glanced toward the center of the ballroom, where Olivia Bennett and Daniel Brooks were now dancing their first official dance as a married couple while guests watched and applauded. "Pride," he said simply. Maya followed his gaze toward the dance floor. "Pride can be a powerful motivation." Ethan nodded once. "I thought bringing someone unexpected would make a statement." Maya looked back at him with calm understanding. "And now?" Ethan hesitated for a moment before answering. "Now I realize the evening made a different statement entirely." Maya seemed to consider that quietly. Sometimes the most meaningful moments are the ones we never intended to create. Ethan looked around the room again. Several guests were still discussing her speech from earlier, while others occasionally glanced toward them with new interest. The atmosphere had become noticeably more relaxed, almost as if Maya's presence had quietly dismantled some invisible barrier between the different worlds represented in the room. Olivia Bennett and Daniel Brooks finished their dance to warm applause before moving back into the crowd to greet guests again. Olivia's attention drifted briefly toward Ethan and Maya near the window. Her expression this time was not calculating or curious. It carried something closer to thoughtful respect. She seemed to recognize that whatever she had hoped to reveal earlier in the evening had instead revealed something about the room itself. Maya noticed Olivia watching them and offered a small polite nod. Olivia returned the gesture before continuing through the crowd. Ethan exhaled quietly. "I think she understands now." Maya asked gently. "Understands what?" "That the story she expected tonight is not the one people will remember." Maya looked around the ballroom once more, watching the movement of the reception as laughter and music filled the air. Weddings often become memorable for reasons no one planned. Ethan smiled slightly at that. "I imagine Daniel did not expect a discussion about urban planning to become the highlight of his reception." Maya laughed softly. "Cities shape people. People shape stories. Tonight just happened to combine both." A brief silence followed as they watched the celebration continue. Ethan eventually turned back toward her with a thoughtful expression. "What will you do when this evening ends?" Again, and tonight, in the most unexpected setting possible, that door had quietly appeared. The reception had reached the warm, unguarded stage of the evening when the formal traditions slowly gave way to genuine celebration. The band had shifted into livelier music and more guests had gathered on the dance floor beneath the soft golden chandeliers. Laughter echoed through the ballroom while the city lights outside the tall windows shimmered against the glass like distant stars. Ethan Carter remained beside Maya Johnson near the edge of the room, watching the movement of the celebration with quiet reflection. Earlier that day, he had imagined the evening would be a brief appearance, a controlled moment of pride, perhaps even a small personal victory. Instead, the night had quietly rearranged the way he saw the room, the people in it, and the woman standing beside him. Maya appeared comfortable now in a way that made it seem as if she had always belonged in spaces like this. She spoke briefly with a few guests who approached her with genuine interest about her work and her perspective on cities and community development. What surprised Ethan most was how easily she navigated the conversations. There was no attempt to impress anyone, no effort to prove anything. She simply answered questions with thoughtful honesty. That quiet confidence drew people in more effectively than any performance could have. As one group of guests moved away, Ethan turned toward her with a thoughtful expression. "Earlier tonight, you said something during your speech." Maya looked at him with mild curiosity. "Which part?" "To join the floor." Olivia moved gracefully through the crowd, greeting guests as she passed. When she approached Ethan and Maya, she paused for a moment. Her expression was calm, sincere, and noticeably different from the carefully controlled curiosity she had shown earlier in the evening. "Maya Johnson," Olivia said warmly. "I wanted to thank you for your honesty tonight." Maya met her gaze politely. "Thank you for inviting me to speak." Olivia gave a small, thoughtful smile. "I believe tonight surprised all of us in ways we did not expect." Her eyes briefly moved toward Ethan before returning to Maya. "Sometimes the most unexpected guests remind us of something important about ourselves." Maya nodded gently. "Weddings are about new beginnings, believing that success only existed in rooms like this." Maya listened quietly. Ethan turned back toward her. "Tonight reminded me that the most interesting stories often start outside the rooms where people expect them." Maya smiled faintly at that. "The best cities are built the same way. Not from the tallest buildings, but from the people who care about the spaces between them." Ethan considered her words carefully before speaking again. "When you go to Chicago tomorrow?" Maya nodded. "Yes." Ethan hesitated for a moment. "I hope you remember something." Maya waited patiently. "That subway bench this morning may have looked like the beginning of a difficult chapter," Ethan said, "but tonight proved it was actually the beginning of something far better." Maya looked around the ballroom one more time as laughter and music continued filling the elegant space. "Perhaps beginnings are simply moments we do not recognize until later," she said softly. And as the celebration carried on around them beneath the warm lights of the reception hall, both of them understood that the most important part of the evening had never been the wedding itself. It had been the unexpected story that quietly unfolded beside it. The reception slowly drifted toward the quiet final hours of the evening as the music softened and the golden chandeliers reflected gently across the marble floors. Some guests had already begun saying their goodbyes while others lingered near the dance floor, reluctant to leave the warm atmosphere that had filled the ballroom throughout the night. Ethan Carter stood near the tall windows once again, watching the city skyline that stretched across Manhattan like a glowing reminder that the world beyond the reception hall never truly slept. The events of the evening replayed in his mind with surprising clarity. Just that morning he had been standing outside a subway entrance feeling the quiet weight of an old chapter in his life. Now the night was ending with an entirely different understanding of how unpredictable life could be. Maya Johnson stood beside him, holding a small glass of water as she looked around the nearly empty dance floor where a few guests still swayed slowly to the final song of the night. "It seems weddings have a way of stretching time," she said softly. Ethan nodded slightly. "Earlier tonight it felt like the evening would never end. Now it feels like it happened in a few minutes." Maya smiled faintly. "The important moments usually do." A group of guests passed by them with warm goodbyes as they made their way toward the exit. Several paused briefly to shake Maya's hand or thank her again for her speech. Each interaction carried the same quiet respect that had gradually replaced the curiosity people felt when she first entered the room. Ethan noticed how naturally she responded to each person, always calm, always thoughtful, never appearing overwhelmed by the sudden attention. When the last of the departing guests disappeared through the tall doors, the ballroom felt larger and quieter than it had all evening. The band packed away their instruments while staff began carefully clearing the remaining glasses from the tables. Across the room, Olivia Bennett and Daniel Brooks were speaking with a few close family members before leaving for their honeymoon flight later that night. Olivia glanced toward Ethan and Maya one final time and offered a small wave. It carried the calm understanding of someone who knew that the evening had taken a very different path than the one she originally imagined. Maya returned the gesture with a polite nod. "She seems at peace now," Maya said quietly. Ethan looked toward the newly married couple. "I think tonight helped close a chapter for both of us." Maya studied him for a moment before asking gently, "Do you feel different than you did this morning?" Ethan gave a thoughtful breath. "Very different." Maya waited. Ethan looked toward the subway station entrance, visible far down the street through the tall windows of the ballroom. "This morning, I thought success meant proving something to the people who doubted you. Tonight reminded me that success is often quieter than that." Maya tilted her head slightly. "How so?" Ethan looked back at her. "Sometimes success is simply meeting the right person at the exact moment when both of your stories need to change direction." Maya did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked out at the glowing city again, as if considering the thousands of different lives moving through its streets at that very moment. Tomorrow morning, I will be on a flight to Chicago, she said calmly. Ethan nodded. You will do well there. Maya smiled softly. I believe the work will matter. A brief silence followed before Ethan spoke again. There is something I would like to ask you. Before the night ends. Maya turned toward him with mild curiosity. What is that? Ethan looked directly at her. When you accepted my invitation this morning, it was meant to last only a few hours. Maya nodded slowly. That was the arrangement. Ethan gave a quiet smile. I am wondering if perhaps the arrangement could change slightly. Maya raised an eyebrow with gentle amusement. In what way? Ethan glanced once more at the nearly empty ballroom before returning his attention to her. When your work in Chicago begins, I would like to help support the project if it needs investors or resources. Cities need thoughtful planners more than they need another glass office tower. Maya looked at him carefully, recognizing the sincerity behind the offer. You would invest in community housing. Ethan shrugged lightly. After tonight, I think it is time I start investing in something that actually improves the cities I live in. Maya considered his words for a moment before extending her hand. Then perhaps our stories will cross again sooner than either of us expected. Ethan shook her hand gently, the quiet agreement carrying far more meaning than the simple gesture suggested. Outside the windows, the lights of New York continued glowing across the dark sky, while the last of the reception staff dimmed the chandeliers overhead. As Ethan and Maya walked toward the exit together, the echo of the evening remained behind them in the silent ballroom. A morning that began with a chance meeting on a subway bench had ended with two people discovering that the most important chapters of life often begin when you step into a room where you were never expected to belong.